Alright guys, here we are again. So I wanted to do a bit of an introductory flight that talks about how we approach flying an aircraft for the first time. So this is really the realm of, say, test pilots or highly qualified flight instructors who might have authorization to be able to fly an aircraft without any prior training. Typically in a light aircraft such as this, fairly unsophisticated machine with limited systems. And of course in the test flight environment if you're an experimental test pilot flying an aircraft for the first time, or perhaps a home-built aircraft as well. Now, I'm not a professional test pilot by any stretch of the imagination. I have done a reasonable amount of test flying throughout my career and a couple of courses, but nothing substantial, certainly nothing that you would get as a professional test pilot or military test pilot going through a test pilot school. But the principles that I'll talk about are fairly standard sort of stuff and how we would approach a new aeroplane. And the reason I'm doing this is, for those of you watching the videos that I'm making and any of the other many tutorials you can find, you obviously want to do a bit more with the sim and try to understand how it's done in the real world and to learn about flying in general. So my intention with this one is to give you something systematic. So when you're flying an aircraft for the first time in the sim, or even if you've been flying it for a while but there's many things you don't know about, then this is a way of approaching a new type and really just being systematic about how we approach an airplane and essentially evaluate its flight characteristics and teach ourselves to fly it. So we're going to cover a few things. I'm not going to go into huge detail on anything, but essentially the format of the flight will be, we'll do a quick pre-flight, talk about some of the external features which we can use to give us an idea about how the aircraft might handle. We'll look at the systems and the layout in the cockpit here, and then we'll take off. We'll find out how it taxis, how it climbs. We'll do some air work to understand how it maneuvers, how stable it is. We'll look at the stall speed so we can figure out what sort of approach and landing speed we can expect. We'll have a look at how the instruments operate in flight and any considerations related to that. Maybe a little bit of stability work, and then we'll do a practice approach at altitude to see how the aircraft feels at slower speeds, and also climbing away if we had to do a go-round, and then we'll just come back and land. So it should take sort of 30 to 40 minutes to go through this process. So you can skip to any of the relevant chapters that interest you. So we're in the DA-20 Diamond aircraft. I haven't flown one of these in real life or in the sim. I've never flown this. So essentially what you see here is the real deal. This is the first time I have approached this airplane. So as I mentioned before, let's say we approach the aircraft for the first time on the outside, as of course we would, and immediately we have a bunch of information here. So I know it's built by Diamond, who've traditionally built gliders, so we can see this very long narrow tail means that it's kind of gliderish just in that look. So it's going to be quite a light airplane, mostly carbon fibre, and it is going to be potentially, because it's quite a skinny little tail there, we don't have a lot of surface area for gusty wind. So I'd imagine it could be quite laterally unstable in turbulence, but we'll see. We can see it's got a massive rudder, which is quite interesting. The rudder is almost as big as the actual vertical stabilizer itself, and we've also got a sort of a ventral fin here as well, which indicates that the aircraft really needs quite a lot of stability, and that probably makes up for the fact that it doesn't have a lot of surface area on the fuselage and the tail boom area, I guess you'd call it. So they've had to add on this little bit of extra surface area there to give us some stability with the tail. We've got this is called a offset hinge, which means that the rudder is actually going to, this horn here is going to project into the airflow. So if we push the rudder to the right like that, we can see that this horn actually projects slightly into the left hand side, and that is just going to slightly change the center of balance and the mass of the rudder as we move it, but we won't go into too much detail there. We've got a fixed trim tab here, so we can't adjust the rudder trim. It's fixed, and that's pretty common for most light aircraft with relatively low powered engines. The elevator, so we can see it's a high elevator mount, so the elevator is not mounted down here, it's mounted at the top, so that already tells us as well that this is going to mean we have certain flight characteristics with that configuration, and you can see it's mounted quite a long way forward as well, so the rudder's really sticking out the back on its own. So we're going to have awesome directional control, I'd imagine, with that massive rudder sticking way out the back by itself. And with the high mounted elevator, that's going to have some implications for our stall characteristics, and potentially you could end up in a deep stall situation, but I do doubt that. I think that's going to be well above the dirty air. So when the wing stalls, you get dirty air rolling off the wings, and if the elevator's here, then that will get hit by that dirty air and lose its effectiveness. So by mounting it up high like that, then the elevator is going to be well clear of the dirty air coming off a stalled wing, and therefore give us elevator authority even as the aircraft stalls aerodynamically. So that's probably why it's mounted up the top. And we can see that these little this surface in the back here is the elevator trim, and it's got two hinges with this little bracket. So this is the hinge, and I'm just manipulating that there. And so you can let's see how well this is actually modelled. Okay, so sometimes in these types of aeroplanes, when you move the elevator, the trim moves. This whole setup here means that the trim moves as the elevator moves as well, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So we'll have a look at that more closely when we get inside. So essentially this is a bit like this fixed trim tab, except that of course we can move it throughout the flight. But it's a pretty solid setup there, with lots of hardware holding that in place. So that's the elevator. So another thing that we can take a look at is it's a very smooth wing. There's no vortex generators, so these are little tiny, basically little blades that you might see a line of. They have them on the Cessnas out towards the wingtips, and particularly in front of the ailerons. So this is really a laminar wing, so it has a very smooth airfoil section, which is also common on gliders and aircraft with quite a high aspect ratio. So the aspect ratio is basically how wide is it compared to how long is it, or I should say actually how wide are the wings compared to how skinny they are. So we can see that it's quite a long wingspan, and they're quite skinny. And we've also got these winglets on the end as well, so that's going to reduce our vortice at the end and allow us to fly more efficiently in cruise, and also have better slow speed characteristics as well. Another interesting feature here is that we've got pretty much full span ailerons. So the oh no, sorry, we do not. Disregard, I couldn't see the seam. So ailerons, so flaps are in the inboard section here, covering looks like about 2/3 of the wing, and the ailerons are covering the final third of the wing. And interestingly, we get this little bit of fence. If you look in the other wing there, we can see that there's a protrusion of the aileron up into the slipstream there. So that's some mass balance, which will help prevent flutter and also improve our aileron control. Nav lights by the looks of things there. So it'll be a red on the left and a green on the right as always. Landing light in the nose. Let's see, what else can we say? So we've got a two-bladed propeller. That's where the starter gear is here, just this little dimple under the prop. This is where the gear engages to start the engine. It's just a single wheel, so there's just one wheel per axle, which is pretty standard for a small aircraft like this. And we can also see that the nose wheel is connected on both sides, so sometimes you might just have an arm on one side of the nose wheel. Let's have a look here. It almost, we'll have to find out once we get moving, but it could well be a castering nose wheel. I'm not entirely sure about that. I'm not sure if we actually have nose wheel steering. It might be castering, meaning that this thing will just go whichever way the aircraft's pointing, and we steer using the brakes, but we will find out soon enough. Quite a few little air scoops and things to cool off accessories generally. Alternator oil coolers, the oil cooler will be under this one, and that's about it. This is probably just an air vent, and we can see these are the two flat brackets on each side. Probably fuel drains. That's a brake line. Tie down ring. These are our other right nav light. Sorry, this is just an overflow vent for the fuel. And that's about it. There's one thing I wanted to check is Okay, this would be where we check the oil for the engine. There's a little panel there with a quick release fastener. Looks like the canopy hinges backwards on this hinge bracket here. This is a GPS sensor, and looks like these, just trying to figure out if those are fuel caps or where you'd stand. It seems like a pretty strange place to put a fuel cap, but yeah, it might be, but hard to tell actually. But oh no, is that the fuel cap there? Yeah, that's the fuel cap there, is it? Or is that just a lock for the canopy? Bit hard to tell. There's a placard there too, but I can't quite read it. Let's see if is there one on the other side. There is not. I have a feeling that could be the fuel cap. So if that's the case, that tells us that the aircraft probably just has one fuel tank in here somewhere. There's no fuel stored in the wings. But I was wondering if these were fuel caps, but I don't think so. They may just be an inspection panel to check the spar of the aircraft as well. But we might find out once we get inside. So that's about it. So we can see we can have good visibility, particularly out the front here, but with the low wing, the pilot is sitting kind of on top of the centre of lift. So if you think about the looking at the aerofoil of the wing here, so the lift is generally, if you could choose a point or select a point where the lift is sort of balanced, it's going to be in about this position here. And so where the pilot is sitting in relation to that is going to determine a bit about how the aeroplane feels to fly and its stability. So yeah, that's about it from there. So we're back inside, so we can see it's a steam-driven aircraft, you could say, without any big fancy glass cockpits, which I really like. It's nice to see just some good old-fashioned round gauges. A lot easier to fly without having to learn computer programming just to get the bloody thing airborne. So that's about it. Down here we've got essentially all aircraft are going to have maybe 4 or 5 different types of systems or some component thereof. So obviously you're going to have an electrical system, which is what you need for your radios and to start the thing up. Some aircraft are going to have a pneumatic system, so that's anything to do with air. That could be used in brakes, pressurization, bleed air from the engines, and all manner of different types of systems that use some form of pressurized air. You're going to have hydraulics in some aircraft, which we use generally for flight control actuation or landing gear retraction and extension, maybe flaps sometimes. And what else would you use hydraulics for? Those are the main ones, probably some others I've forgotten just thinking about it. Then you could also have bleed air, I mentioned, some sort of fire protection systems, but most of that stuff we don't have, so and the fuel system of course. So in a simple light aircraft such as this, we know we've got an electrical system, and we can tell that aside from the fact we've got a big red button that says master switch, but we've got a whole row of circuit breakers here. So these are non-resettable circuit breakers, and the number there indicates the amps that is drawn by that particular circuit. So these are essentially a fuse, and if the fuse blows, then these just pop out and you can't push them back in. I don't think you can. Or maybe you can actually. These look like they are resettable circuit breakers, but in some of them, in fact I think it might be the 172, you can see there's a bunch of white ones which are non-resettable, but in fact these look like they are. So you can see that there's a battery generator, and then the rest is pretty much just instruments with pretty low draw. And so this gives you an idea about all the things drawing electrical power on the airplane, which is quite a lot. Flaps are electrically powered. These are the instruments, the directional gyro and artificial horizon, turn and balance, that's this one. And the fuel gauge, we've got a fuel pump, lights, and starter, which is interesting. It's just on the same one. And you can see that there's 2 electrical buses and 1 avionics bus. So that just gives us a bit of insight into how complicated the electrical system is, which is not very complicated. There's pretty much a turn it on and go, and any of these systems could be isolated by just pulling out the circuit breaker. That's about it. So typically I'd expect it to be about a 12 volt DC system in a little airplane like this. And we can see that it's electric flaps because we've got a switch for it. We don't have a mechanical lever like you do in some aircraft, like the Cub and things like that. Engine controls, that's what I forgot to mention before. Obviously power plant is another key system, is the engine. So we have the throttle, we can see here, and we've actually got a prop control, which is interesting for a light aircraft with a two-bladed prop like this, quite a small one. It surprises me that it does have a variable pitch propeller, and we can also tell because we've got an RPM gauge there as well, and that's the manifold pressure. So the throttle is manipulating or controlling this manifold pressure, and the prop lever is controlling the RPM. We can just zip over here and have a quick look at the instruments. These look like they're out of a car, and they probably are, to be honest. So manifold pressure reads in inches of mercury, and on the ground here it's reading ambient atmospheric pressure. So essentially this is the same as your QNH, so that's 2992 or so. So this should read 2992 as well. And then once we get some, this is the manifold pressure, so the pressure inside the manifold, the inlet to the cylinders of the engine. So as we start the engine, this will drop right back down, and then it'll increase as we increase the throttle later. RPM, and these are all handily placarded, so we can see that the red line limit, so the maximum speed if we want the RPM is 2500. There's a small amber range which goes from say 25 to 24, and then the rest is green through the operating range of the airplane. This is just a tachometer to record the number of hours, so we can keep track of that. That's the same thing here. This is a Hobbs meter which records the hours, and these can be set to when the battery is on. Some of them are set to when the engine's running, and some are set to when the aircraft is actually in the air. Oil pressure and temperature are the main ones. Engine sort of health monitoring gauges you see in a light aircraft. We're not really too concerned about where it is as long as it's in this green range here. So when we say T's and P's in the green, I'm just saying all temperature is somewhere in the green, all pressure is somewhere in the green, and they will fluctuate depending on how much power you've got, what the atmospheric conditions are like, and so on. Ammeter, charge, discharge. We'll see how this one's wired, as we've seen in the was it the Cessna, the 172. It seems to be working in the opposite sense, which I have logged as a bug, so we'll see what this one does. Fuel gauge, pretty straightforward, and this should be coolant temperature. So this aeroplane has a water-cooled engine, which is kind of unusual. So looking back out to the front here, I said this would be an oil cooler, but I expect this is probably just a radiator in the front then, and this is the cooler, just like on the front of a car. So the air's going to come in, cool the water, and the water's going to circulate around the engine and cool it. And you can see we don't have big scoops around the side, so there's not a lot of air actually flowing directly into the engine itself. We've got an ELT, which we all need to have, and that will go off in the event of an accident. A certain G switch will activate that, or we can just manually turn it on, so it should be in the armed position. And that's about it. What else can we talk about? So these are just our general primary instruments. There's always 6 of them. AH in the middle, directional indicator below, airspeed, altitude, turn and bank, and vertical speed here. We've got just the switches for all of our lights, one for the fuel pump, and avionics master switch as well. Not all aircraft have an avionics master, but most of them with more sophisticated avionics like a GPS tend to have an avionics master, just to mean that we can isolate that from any spikes we might get while starting the engine. So the biggest draw in the airplane really is going to be the starter motor, and so we don't want to have all of this stuff powered, and then when we hit the starter we draw a massive current off the battery and it doesn't have enough power to power this stuff, and then we can fry the electronics if it has an undercurrent condition. So that's why we just have a separate avionics master. This is just the intercom which we use to talk between pilots, or pilot and passenger. And there's a couple of enunciator lights here, so fuel pressure, generator control, because there's no alternator switch. It's just if the battery's on, the alternator's on pretty much, or the generator is on. So if it's not working, that would illuminate coolant level, so that's your water, and then voltage, so that would come up when the battery's discharged to a certain point. But as I said, it's probably about a 12 volt battery system in this, so 12 volt electrical system, so if it drops say below 10 or 8, maybe that'd come on, maybe lower. Carbon monoxide detector, and the GPS which we use to set comm, transponder. We talked about the flaps. These are just for so that's hot air, so that'll just bring in a bit of air from a manifold around the exhaust into the cockpit to warm us up. Parking brake, and we've got a carb heat in this thing as well, so carburetor heat, we can use that to at low power settings to ensure we don't get ice building up in the carb. And here's a choke. Now there's a little placard here which tells us how to start it. No, it doesn't really say too much at all. So I'm not sure how the choke would be used in this aeroplane. I don't think we're going to need it. This looks like just the locking mechanism for the canopy, and yeah, most aircraft are going to have a fuel cock of some sort, so this is pretty much just an on-off button by the looks of things. And you can see it's that would be in the off position there, so if it's here, nothing's going to happen. And you can see that's guarded, so it's got a guard over top of it to stop us inadvertently bumping that with your foot or your leg to moving your fuel off. Oh, and here we've got the pitch trim. So rather than having an electric pitch trim or even a wheel, which we can just move gently sort of up and down like in the Cessna, this is all of these holes are punched here, and each one of these is a pitch setting. So you would lift up that knob, move it to the hole that you want, and drop it down to lock it into place. So you're essentially just physically moving that elevator tab up and down on the tail. We do have it modelled to our switch, so we can do it like that, which is not very realistic, but I'm not going to look down and try and fiddle around with that the whole time, so we'll just use our use the stick, the button on the stick anyway. Alright, that's about it. So these are the sort of first impressions. It's not going to be particularly powerful, it's not going to go very fast. We can get a pretty good idea of that just looking at the airspeed indicator. This tells us the V&E, or the velocity never exceed, is about 161 knots, and we've got knots on the outside, kilometres an hour on the inside, depending on what you're used to, so we'll use knots. We can see the top of the green is our manoeuvring speed, so that looks like it's about 116 knots, and the white arc is the flap operating range, so 80 knots for that. And then the stall speed, flaps out, is going to be the bottom of the white, which looks like about 38 knots, which is the same as a 152, and flaps up is going to be something like 45. So that's some stuff we can take from here. This is going to show us the volts and the outside air temperature, and our mags as well, of course. So yeah, that's about it. So what I could expect from handling characteristics. Sorry it's taken so long to get through this, but these are just some important things which will save us a lot of time later when we actually get in the air, where we just want to kind of have a sense of what the hell's going to be going on with this aeroplane. We expect it's probably, or we know that's going to have a slow stall speed, and with that tail being mounted so high, that's going to make for some interesting stall characteristics, I think. So we can crank her up. So we'll just put the battery on. It does have a fuel pump, so the fuel cock I selected on. Parking brake is set. We'll go to full throttle, and we should get a bit of fuel flow. There's no fuel flow gauge, so we'll say that that's primed. I'm going to close the throttle, crack it a touch. Check the prop area is clear. We're not going to turn the strobe lights on, and start. Okay, so we'll bring it back to 1000. We're looking for oil pressure, which we got in the green, and the oil temperature will rise as the thing starts warming up. And look, this is how it should operate. So we could see that we got a charge there as the battery, the generator recharged the battery from that start, so that went up into the positive, and that's how it should operate. And it wasn't in the other aircraft. As I turn the avionics master on, we should get a slight change, but we didn't. Just going to turn all the lights on to see if we get any change in the amps here. Okay, I said it should have been maybe a 12 volt system. Full of shit, it's a 28 volt system, so we can see that there. And we can see the OAT is 19 degrees, nice and warm, very good. This is just showing different types of time, so this would be universal time or Zulu time. The LT will be local time, so I've got 8:36 in the morning. This will be flight time, showing how long that the thing's been running for. Obviously it's not 24 minutes, and then this is elapsed time, and we can use this just as a timer, and that's normally, hold it down to reset it, and it even tells you maybe. No, not working, doesn't matter, so we'll just go back to local time. Okay, QNH is set, so on the ground we're at 340 feet, we're at Masterton here, where we've operated last time. So we taxi out to on the grass here to the seal, and we'll just take off on runway 24 to the south. And we'll climb up to 3,000 feet to the east of the airfield in this area. Nice clear day for our handling exercise. So that's about it. Transponder we can put into standby, let that boot up. Masterton set in the GPS conveniently, that's nice. That's about it. So there's 3 stages of flaps. We can have a look at that now. So there's a takeoff setting. Okay, that's indicated by a white LED, and a full setting, still also a white LED. So if we see white, we know that we've got flaps out. If we see green, we know the flaps are up. And it looks like it only indicates when the flaps are in that position as well. So that's kind of cool. Okay, I'll just set 1200. Alright, that's about it. So we'll, the first sort of thing we want to have a think about is the taxi. As I mentioned before, I'm not sure if we have nose wheel steering. We definitely have brakes, because I can see the brake cylinders are these gold things here, the brake cylinders. So we definitely have brakes on each side, and we've got a parking brake as well. So we'll release the parking brake. Mastered in traffic, Delta Mike Oscar is at the fuel pump, taxiing via the grass for runway 24 seal. Alright, let's get going. So I'll apply the brakes first off. Okay, brakes are working. Just going to turn track IR on. Okay, well, pedal steering is working. So Maniac on a forklift coming straight for us. We'll give him a bit of room. Okay, so handling is pretty good on the ground, very responsive. There's the windsock over there showing full out, which is not at all what I'm expecting to find when we get a bit closer. I'm not sure there, see it's just dropped down there. So it's favouring runway 24, taking off in that direction, which is good. Okay, so having never flown this aeroplane before, all I've got to go on for the stall and low speed characteristics is the bottom of the white and the green arc here for the on the airspeed indicator. But I don't really know how it's going to fly and how it's going to stall. So the safest thing to do is just fly it fast. So I'm not going to rotate as soon as it gets to 40 knots. I'm going to probably go somewhere between 50 and 60 knots before we try and rotate the aeroplane off the ground, and that just makes sure we've got plenty of speed above the stall to fly away cleanly, and we can go and investigate that a bit more closely once we get up to altitude. So we're all clear on the left. If this was the first operation or flight of a new aircraft or a aircraft that had just been built, then we'd probably do a high-speed taxi test before we actually take off for the first time as well, depending on how common the type is and how many we've built. Mastered in traffic, Delta Mike Oscar enters runway 24 seal to backtrack and line up. Just in the interest of time, I'm just going to cut out the run-up because we've seen a run-up in a couple of the videos. So normally we'd check our RPM. We could cycle the prop here, which I'll do anyway, if I can find it. I find it's quite hard to find the touch points sometimes. Okay, so that's had an effect. So the prop control's working. So that's just cycling a bit of oil through the governor and the mags, so we'd have checked the mags as well. Okay, so I'll put the strobes and landing lights on, and I'll put the fuel pump on here. You can hear that running. Transponder goes to alt. Okay, we'll just go this far. I'm just conscious that I seem to spend about half an hour talking before we even go flying, so no one's probably even watching this anyway. So we will line up. Back to the left here. So I'm just using full rudder and a bit of left brake to line up. And we'll quickly do some pre-takeoff checks here. So the trim's set. I don't know where the takeoff position is, so we'll say it's about in the middle. Throttle friction, don't seem to have one of those. Mixture, we don't have one of those. Instruments, yeah, instruments are checked, so the oil temperature is very high. So that's one to note. We'll keep an eye on that. Coolant temperature is fine. Oil pressure is the main one though, that's all good. Ignition's on both. We've got fuel cockers on, and the flaps are set for takeoff. Hatches and harnesses, so we check our seat belts. These seem to be locked. All good. This is probably an emergency release. And the controls, we'll check those. So we just stir the porridge Okay, we can see the toe brakes there. Very cool. Alright, and the transponder was an old Mustard in traffic, Delta Mike Oscar, rolling runway 24, vacating to the east, climbing 3,000 feet. Alright, here we go. So as I mentioned, I'll just be looking for somewhere between 50 and 60 knots. It may want to fly earlier than that because I suspect it probably will because it's quite a light aircraft, but the idea is we want to be well above the stall speed anyway. So I'll just bring the power up on the brakes. So that's full power. So I'm getting 2,500 RPM and about 30 inches of manifold pressure. The T's and P's are in the green, so the engine's good. Brakes are released. Slight pull to the left, which I'm just compensating for with a bit of right rudder. Okay, airspeed is alive and increasing. So you can see nothing's happening particularly quick. It's wanting to fly. I'm just going to hold the nose down. There's 40 knots. Okay, it really wants to fly, so I'll fly it at 50. There it goes. And she pretty much has just levitated off the ground. So we'll look for 60 knots there for initial climb. Seems to be about 500 feet a minute. All clear. Just keep the climb going. All temperature and pressure is good. Coolant temperature is good. So 500 feet a minute at around 65 knots seems to be pretty comfortable. There's 200 AGL. I'm just going to keep the flaps in the takeoff position till we get a little bit higher. About 500 feet would be nice. All clear. Going to just start a very gentle left turn to keep us away from those trees. And always thinking if we had an engine failure now, this is the first flight I've done in the aeroplane. It's not much wind, but I'd be looking for one of those orange paddocks there probably. Okay, that's 500 feet, so I'm going to put the flaps up. And we can see we get quite a nose down pitching moment, so I'm arresting that with nose up elevator. You can see the speed has increased quite a bit, we're up to 80 knots now. I'm still at full power, so we'll resume that climb. So with flaps up we get quite a significant improvement in climb rate. So we've got about 700 feet a minute. All clear. Keep the left turn going. And we're just going to stay over these flat paddocks if we can. You can see there's some terrain to the left, so we'll be trying to avoid that. So we've got the maximum altitude between us and the ground. So it's performing pretty well. We're at just under 80 knots. I'm just doing some gentle medium turns here in the climb. And it feels all pretty harmonised. Nothing unusual so far. So 80 knots seems like quite a fast climb in this aeroplane, so I'll probably come back to 70 knots in a second. Mustard in traffic, Delta Mike Oscars, 1 mile to the southeast, passing through 1,700 feet, climbing 3,000. We'll be operating in this area for 20 minutes. So there's no traffic around. We can turn the fuel pump off now. And the landing lights can go off as well, but I'll leave the strobes on. Okay, so I'll increase rate of climb to 70 knot climb here. And I've still got full power, haven't touched that. All pressure is at the top of the green, but still in the green. Coolant temperature, all temperatures come down a bit, so we're looking pretty good. Just looking for 70 knots. It does seem pretty comfortable. You know, all aeroplanes just have that sweet spot where they want to be. So it seemed that about 80 knots was definitely where it wanted to be. And we'll get an idea, because if we hit 70 knots here, and the rate of climb decreases, we know we've got more drag than lift going on. So that's 70 knots. Haven't seen a big change in the rate of climb. It's still sitting around 600 or 700 feet a minute. Just trimming for that. Okay, clear on the left. And we'll just start a gentle right turn here. Okay, the speed's dropped off a bit. We're actually getting a bit of turbulence off those hills. Seems a bit exaggerated because there's not much wind here. I'm looking for 70 knots again. So first impressions, yeah, no surprises really. It feels nice and stable, and considering it's a light training aircraft, then you would imagine it should have very docile handling characteristics. So 65 knots, still climbing, yeah, about 500 feet a minute now, so it seems to have a better climb rate between 70 and 80 knots, so we'll slow the nose and increase the speed a touch. And approaching 3,000 feet. Okay, T's and P's still in the green. So once we reach 3,000 here, there's not much inertia, so I can pretty much get to 3,000 and then level off. I don't really need to anticipate that much. So now I'm just driving for level flight. No trim yet, and I'm just holding the stick pressure nose down to allow the aeroplane to accelerate, and I'm just going to introduce a bit of nose down trim there, and as I do so I'm progressively increasing nose down trim and reducing the nose forward stick, just trying to find that balance. And I'd expect it should, it's a bit too far, it should cruise around 105, 110 knots. Okay, I'll bring the power back now to 23 inches of RPM. Manifold pressure, and I'll reduce the RPM to 2300 as well. So that's going to be pretty much it's a bit hard to tell in this light, but just around there somewhere. Okay, and now there's going to be a trim change required, and we're sitting at 105 knots. Try and get back to 3,000. T's and P's are still in the green. Tiny bit of turbulence around, not too much. Alright, so it's a pretty stable aeroplane, as you'd expect. We'll start a right turn in a moment. We're all clear out here. Okie dokie, so we'll start that right turn. And I'm just looking at the attitude. It's quite a nose-low attitude compared to the VL3 that I've been flying a lot lately. As always, the nose drops in the turn, so we've got to pick that back up. And I can already feel how stable it is, because as I roll into that turn, about 20 degrees, it just stays there comfortably. If it was an unstable aircraft, it would want to keep rolling. And yeah, so I'm not holding any real control inputs in here, just a little bit of back stick to keep the nose up. Alright, so that's just coming through about 270 degrees a turn. Bring it back around to the left. We're all clear. And just holding the nose on the horizon. Got a 30 degrees angular bank this time, and the speed is pretty steady, around 100 knots now. Okay. Alright, no surprises there. The trim's pretty effective. Okay, I've lost a bit of speed in that turn. I'm just trying to climb back to 3,000 feet. And we'll roll out on south. Okay. Alright, so far so good. So now we can do some slow speed work. So first thing we want to do is just start progressively bringing the power back. We don't want to do anything in a hurry, because we don't want shock cooling on the engine. So if you're changing power settings, you just want to do that fairly gradually. So it's 14 degrees outside, so it's around ISO conditions in 2992. Just retrim now for 20 inches of manifold pressure. And you could look around. Okay, so the first stall we do is what we call a clean stall. So this is where we just close the throttle and just maintain altitude until the aircraft stalls with the flaps up. So this is a clean configuration stall. So we'll do that on this heading. So we just do some hazel checks. So height, we're at just up to 3,000 feet, so we've got plenty of altitude. Airframe will be flaps up. Security, all hatches and harnesses are secure. Engine, T's and P's are in the green, coolant temperature's fine. Location, so we're not over a built-up area. And lookout, so we'll just do a quick S-turn here to make sure we've cleared the nose in case there was traffic under the nose. And I'll make a radio call. Nice in traffic, Delta Mike Oscar is operating 5 miles south of the field at 3,000 feet. Okay, no traffic, so we'll roll back out on heading 210. And I will close the throttle. So I've just closed the throttle back to full idle there. And now I'm just increasing the elevator back pressure to maintain 3,000 feet. We can see the speed is decreasing. And I'm pretty much going to trim for about the speed here. So that means I'm increasing the elevator trim to about this point. And now I'm not going to trim anymore. And she's just sitting there. So once we got that first 20 knots off, 20 or 30 knots, it stayed pretty. Okay, we can see the rate of descent's increasing. I'm looking for either a stall warning or a buffet. There it goes. So we're very close to the stall. Should be near the bottom of the green arc because we're clean. It's coming. Okay, we've got a little bit of drift to the left. There it goes. Okay, so we just release the back pressure, power on, and start recovering. So we've lost a couple hundred feet there, and want to be careful not to increase the back pressure too quickly so we don't enter a secondary stall. So we're all clear, so we'll do a turnaround to the right and climb back up to 3,000 feet. So that felt pretty good. That is, let's have a look at my map. That's Greytown, we've just passed there. Yeah, so it flies pretty slow. I should have kept it more level. We were descending there, but there was no adverse characteristics. It didn't drop a wing to the left or the right. It just stayed pretty much neutral. And it recovered virtually as soon as I released the back pressure on the stick. So that's what we'd expect to see. It did start to feel quite mushy. By mushy we mean the control effectiveness really drops as you get close to the stall. So we'll level at 3,000 feet, back to 20 inches just to cool the engine a bit. And this time we'll do a stall with full flaps. So there's takeoff flaps, and we're within the wide arc, so we can go to full flaps now as well. Back to 15 inches of manifold pressure. So it ballooned a lot with the flaps, so as all the aircraft in the sim, and you can see holding level flight, even with a reasonable amount of power, the speed is already decaying there, so there's quite a bit of drag in those flaps. So I'm going to close the throttle, and now we're just going to hold as level as we can, keep it straight. Okay, straight into the stall, and that's pretty much at the bottom of the wide arc. And it's very slow. Okay, so I'm holding full back stick. There's the stall, and okay, bit of a wing drop. So increase the power and bring the nose back up, but don't be in too much of a hurry because we really do not want to have a secondary stall. So we'll go back to takeoff flaps and continue that climb to 3,000 feet. So that felt pretty good. You can get it pretty slow, no question about that. I've got a bit of rudder on there. And the next one we'll do a departure stall. So essentially we've got the flaps at the takeoff position, and this is a power on stall, so we'll do this. It really depends on the aeroplane, but I'll try 20 inches initially and just basically hold this attitude and see if it'll stall, but I think we'll have to go lower than that. We'll start with 15 and we should get more of a wind drop, but I really just held the stick back all the way through that stall warning, and I could have recovered at any time prior to that without too much issue. So it feels very stable. I really had to hold the stick in until the thing just about stopped in the sky to get a wind drop. Okay, and even now 15 inches level flight is just pegged there at 50 knots, so this is too much power. If you stayed here for too long, you'd find your engine would get very hot, so we'll have to reduce the power again. So reduce the power another couple of inches, increase the back pressure to compensate for that. Very steady, can just sit here all day like this. Okay, there's a stall warning. So we do expect to get a wind drop on this one, probably to the left. That's what it did before. So there's a very high nose attitude. Well below the stall speed. And you can see the sink rate, so okay, she went right. Alright, that's a pretty aggressive stall. Just close the throttle. Put the flaps up. And I'll increase the power now. So again, I really held it in there quite a long time in order to get a good aggressive stall. Just come back away from the terrain, and we got it. So that was a very steep nose down pitch moment as the aircraft stalled. There's the airfields out there. So we'll just make our way back towards the west over the lower terrain, and yeah, so you could really recover any time prior to that without too much trouble, but I'm satisfied the control authority was good throughout the speed range, and that gives us a good idea about how slow we can fly this aeroplane. So in terms of an approach speed, we can just set up a dummy approach now from 3,000 feet, so I'll reduce the power to 15 inches. T's and P's are still in the green, we're in a good area. I'll just fly in this heading to avoid that rising terrain, and we'll set flaps, takeoff and approach. And we will just set up a 500 foot per minute rate of descent, and basically just fly it as if we're flying an approach. And we're just looking for the attitude really, because this is so I think 60 knots is probably a good approach speed, so I'll trim for that. So when I say trim for that, that means I'm setting a power setting so that we're descending at 60 knots at about 500 feet a minute. So the first thing I do is adjust the nose attitude for 60 knots, and when I'm flying consistently at 60 knots, then I can modulate the power to set the rate of descent that I want. So I'm a little bit slow, so I'll lower the nose a touch. That's about right. Okay, and the rate of descent is about 400 feet a minute, so I can reduce the power a little bit more and just hold the attitude, and we'll see the rate of descent will increase. So, you know, the manifold pressure is off the bottom of the stop there, so I've got hardly any power on at all. Try and get that 60 knots back. So she's pretty much gliding. But you don't really want to do that because I've got a lot of back stick here. There's not much left. Visibility's not that good, and I don't have a lot left in terms of elevator. Even though I'm well above the stall, it doesn't feel super comfortable to be here. So I think maybe let's try 70 knots. So for this I will just increase the power a bit and lower the nose to get 70 knots. Okay, so that feels better. So 70 knots. I've got a lower nose attitude, I can see a bit more, and that's still not much power. It's right at 10 inches or so. So that feels more comfortable to me. Grey turn again. So we will make a right turn here, and we'll just level off at 2,000 feet. So I'm satisfied with 70 knots as my approach speed, and aiming to touch down between, or somewhere around 50 knots So it's quite a fast approach speed, but until I get used to the airplane, then that's about as slow as I want to go. Okay, that's about all we need to do, so we can have a quick look at stability, which we've pretty much been doing anyway. But in terms of stability, this is just there's a couple of things we can try. So one of them is the Phugoid response. So we'll just clean the flaps up there. We'll get back to 23 inches and kind of a cruise flight here. And the idea with a Phugoid test is that we will essentially get the thing trimmed out for level flight for the power setting that we're at, and that should be around 100 knots or 105 knots as we had before. We pop up, get rid of that, and the idea is, without changing anything, I'm going to just increase the nose attitude until we lose about 10 knots of airspeed, and then just let go of the stick and see what happens. And so we should get an oscillation, because the aircraft is trimmed for 105 knots or so, its cruise power setting, although we're only getting about 90 at the moment, so it seems about right. So we've got 23, 23, and TCP's in the green, still climbing, so that'll be why. So if we can get it back to 100 knots or so, then I'll just increase the nose attitude, wait for 10 knots to bleed off, and then let go of the stick. Seriously. Then we will let the aeroplane just do its thing. But it's most important for this that we start in balance, so trimmed out. And we're pretty close there. So 23, 23, still climbing. We've got about 96 knots, and it's really important to be trimmed, so we'll call that trimmed there. Okay, so my target now is to increase the nose attitude to until we lose 10 knots, which will be 85, and then let go of the stick. So we'll do that now. So I'm just going to increase the nose attitude, wait till we get to 85. Okay, and let go of the stick. And what should happen is the nose should drop, but as the speed increases, we're going to make more lift, and we should see the nose lift up again. All right, there it goes, and we should just see a gentle oscillation. And as the nose goes up, the speed will reduce. And in a stable aircraft, it should return more or less to where we left it, or where we started from, I should say. I'll put a little bit of aileron, but I'm not touching the stick at all here. So we're on our second Phugoid now. So now that's about the original speed, 95 knots. So it's definitely dampened out. So that means that the rate that the nose is moving up and down has reduced from when we did that first input. And it's almost back to its original speed. It's 90. So that's what we'd call a positively statically stable aircraft, because it's pretty much returning to the original trim configuration that it was in, which is good news. Okay, so we've learnt that, and it's still just wandering around, and it's pretty much back at 96 knots and coming back to level flight. So I haven't touched the stick since that first 10 knot change, so that's good news. We can see that it's a very stable aircraft, ideal for these conditions. There's the airfield there. So that's about all we'll go into with the stability and handling for today. And we'll continue for a downwind here and re-land on runway 24. So I'll set up the approach now. So we'll just reduce the power to descend down to 1,300 feet. Mastered in traffic, Delta Mike Oscar is joining downwind, runway 24 seal. We're 2,000 feet. Okay, so I'll just put the fuel pump on now. Brakes are checked, undercarriage is fixed. Make sure we don't have, but the fuel cock is on. quantities checked, and hatches and harnesses are secure. So we're going quite quick. One thing we didn't do is go fast to see how it handles at high speed, but that's enough for today. So there's a few things to keep in mind really. We just got a feel for how the aeroplane handles just in fairly docile conditions without asking too much of it, and then we did some stalls to see what its stall characteristics were like, and again very responsive, pretty docile, until you really pull into it with quite a bit of power on, and then it was quite an aggressive stall, which is to be expected. And we decided that 70 knots is a good approach speed, and that with the first stage of flaps, it's a circuit altitude there, so I'll level off and let the speed come back and get that first stage of flaps out and look for 70 knots for the approach, and then we'll go full flaps on final. Okay, so we're looking for the top of the white arc, which is there. Catch that balloon, start the turn onto base and a bit of a descent, and I'll reduce the power so that we get 70 knots. So I'm increasing the nose attitude for 70 knots and then decreasing the power and the attitude just a little bit to set up that descent, and using elevator trim, positive or nose up trim, to stabilize at the 70 knots. So we're on base. Do a nice long final, so we've got plenty of time to get things squared away. Okay, we'll start the turn to final. So 500 feet a minute's good, 70 knots is good. Landing light on. Okay, so that's about the picture that we had in the sky before. 70 knots, 500 feet a minute, and it feels very comfortable. Go to full flaps there, and the speed should come back around 60 to around 60 knots now with full flap. And a similar attitude, slightly more nose down. You see it's quite twitchy in the pitch there as we are making the changes. And I think there's just a little bit of turbulence isn't helping. But that's about right. 500 feet a minute, 60 knots, that power's back around 10 inches. We'll go to full RPM now, so properly was fully forward in case of a go round. And just maintaining the centre line. We're a bit high, so we'll just reduce the power a bit. No wind to speak of. Aiming for just beyond the numbers. Okay, I'll set into the flare fairly early. And I know it stalls, we're well above the stall speed, so I can afford to float my flare for quite a long way. So power's now idle, and I'm just holding it off. A little bit of a balloon there, hold it, touch down, just above the stall. Keep it straight. A little bit of braking. Tracking the centre line. Alright, T's and P's still in the green. Okay, so pretty easy little aeroplane to fly, no surprises. 70 knots with first stage of flap worked well for the approach, going back to 60 with full flap. And you could certainly go slower than that if you wanted to for a short field landing. But important to keep in mind that it does have pretty aggressive stall characteristics if you get slow with power on. So if you were doing a go around and you didn't raise the flaps and you were very slow, then you could lose control of the aircraft. So you'd want to keep a bit of speed up if you do a go around, so just keep the nose down initially to accelerate back to 70 knots and go to takeoff flaps and climb out from there. So that's it. So that's a bit of an introduction to how we can systematically evaluate the handling characteristics of an aircraft we haven't flown before. Starting off by having a walk around, looking at the aeroplane, taking note of any distinguishing features and thinking about how they might relate to the characteristics, the flying characteristics of the aeroplane. And we'll just sort of do that roughly for some of the other types we fly as we approach them. I won't go into as much detail. We'll just back up over here. But it gives you an idea about some of the things we've been thinking about. So landing lights, fuel pump, and transpond back to standby. And yeah, so I hope you got something out of that. Probably a bit too boring for most people, but it does give you an idea about the sort of things that are going through a pilot's mind when they are flying a new aircraft for the first time. All good. So park and brake was this one. Yeah, I like it. It's good. Nice and responsive. Very simple. RPM seems to be quite high for low power, and the manifold pressure really doesn't. You spend a lot of time on the bottom stop in approach and landing, so it's kind of hard to explain what I mean by that, but you don't need much throttle at all when you're flying slow. So I guess that's a testament to these laminar wings and the fact these guys build gliders, so it's got a pretty good lift ratio. Alright, that's it. We'll cut the mags to shut her off. Avionics off. 27 minutes. Okay, hopefully you got something out of that. Let me know if you want to see any other things, and I'll do my best to make some more videos for you. Cheers.